Well, thank you, everybody, for attending. Good afternoon. I am Mark Roselle, and I serve as Dean of the Schar School of Policy and Government here at George Mason University. Truth on Trial is one of a series of public policy forums put on by the Schar School here at George Mason. The Schar School is one of 10 schools or colleges at George Mason University. We operate both here in Arlington and in Fairfax, Virginia. And we offer a number of degree programs, undergraduate through master's and PhD, in fields of public policy, public administration, political science, international affairs, international security studies, international commerce, and several others. Our programs are very highly ranked, with national security, for example, currently ranked number 3 in the country in the latest U.S. News and World Report rankings. Among our influential institutes and centers that hold events, such as this one today, are the Michael V. Hayden Center on Intelligence Policy and International Security, the Transnational Crime and Corruption Center, the Center for Security Policy Studies, and the newly launched Center for Business Civic Engagement. We have hosted candidate debates and forums, and we have a co-branded poll with the Washington Post. Today's forum follows 2 well-attended, moderated events launched last summer. The panelists are among the most influential legal, communications, and media experts in the country, and they will be introduced by our moderator shortly. The moderator for today's Truth on Trial program is Doug Simon. He is CEO of DS Simon Media, and he is a leading strategist on getting C-suite leaders for both brands and nonprofits on television through satellite media tours and live social media broadcasts. So, Mr. Simon, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Dean Roselle, and welcome everyone to Truth on Trial, Implications for Communicators. It's going to be a great event today, and we're going to really look at finding solutions for PR pros and communications executives to navigate this partisan divide that's really making it harder for everyone to communicate. We hope to inform, we hope to entertain, and with the great panel we have, we hope to make some news as well. We're going to be looking at first public affairs in the digital age, and then the intersection of law and public relations, and finally, media and communications. Very important topic. So we'll get started with our first panel. Seated to my right is Governor Terry McAuliffe, former governor of Virginia. He was the 72nd governor of Virginia, takes great pride in the significant reduction in unemployment and increase in living standards that took place under your watch. He recently stated that he's 50-50 about whether he's going to be running for president on television. We're hoping to change those odds today with this discussion.
Make some news for you today.
Yeah, so we appreciate, we're welcome for this group. I think this is probably a key group of insiders that you want to be speaking with, so I won't make my pitch too hardcore.
The school here is named after Dwight Schar, who was George Bush's finance chair and RNC finance chairman. So if you get him to endorse me, we actually can make some news today.
There you go.
Okay, now we've got that. And seated next to Governor is Maria Cardona. She's principal of the Dewey Square Group and founder of Latinovations, the Latino strategies practice at DSG. And she's on the list of the nation's top 100 most influential Latinos and was senior advisor to the Hillary Clinton for President campaign.
And I worked for this guy, too.
Press secretary to then Chairman Terry McAuliffe.
That's right.
And there's more. I mean, we could just go on and on with the intros, and that could be the whole show, but we've got a lot to cover.
We'll wait and see what Michael says.
That's right.
Special thanks for courage, definitely winning the Panel Courage Award today to Michael Caputo, who was actually in a fender bender on the Beltway in Washington, D.C. on the way over, and said, I'm not going to the doctor, I'm going to Truth on Trial, which we appreciate. Now, the word was, we were surprised to hear that he was rear-ended on the highway. We were expecting he would have been attacked from the left, but, that didn't happen. Come on, you gotta bring it out there. But he appears regularly on CNN, Fox News, MSNBC. I think you've got a couple of TV hits scheduled tonight. And your experience runs from global communications, campaigns, trade associations, Fortune 500 companies.
Wow. And Michael, you got Ty Cobb if you need a lawyer?
No.
Okay.
I gave him my card. card as soon as he explains the story to me.
An old boss of mine, you say, how do I lose control of this?
I thought he followed me here. That's all.
He saw it on the belt.
Well, he might have been looking to pick up a gig from the car accident, but let's not go there. So, Governor, here's the key question that's important. Can a centrist candidate win a presidential race anymore? The divide seems so strong, and that's from either party. Can a centrist candidate be a threat to win?
I hope so. That'd be my. And you say centrist, I mean, listen, my argument, for the Virginians here, we had a great 4 years. We had a record amount of jobs created, hundreds of thousands. Unemployment went from 5.4 to 3.6. We need candidates in, and I always lean and think it should be governors. I mean, in all deference to the senators, governors are CEOs. We run states. We build roads. We clean roads. We create jobs. You know, we're accountable. We don't have filibusters. We got to act every single day. And I think it's important that governors actually get into this race because we're very results-oriented. You want a proven job creator. And listen, I was the most progressive governor in the history of Virginia, restored more felon rights than any governor in American history, kept our women's clinics open, fought all the horrible legislation, had the most vetoes of any governor. But at the same time, I'm all about job creation. I'm all about economic growth, and I think that's what our party needs to stand for. I don't like all these, what I call litmus tests we have today. I was asked yesterday morning, Joe, about the new Green Deal and the issue about Medicare for all. I'm a very results-oriented guy. I want every American to have access to health care, of course, and get the costs down. We have to do things about climate change. But this idea that someone puts an idea and we all agree, and if you don't agree, you're somehow out in the box, I hope that's not what this campaign is going to be all about. It ought to be a font of information and new ideas and policy objectives. And ultimately, I do think that the person with the best ideas and policy will be successful in the nomination.
Yeah, and America is becoming more diverse, Maria, and obviously with your practice, you're taking a role in that. So a question is, can this increased diversity help bring us together as a country? Is that possible, and how do we get there?
Well, frankly, I think it depends on who our leaders are, because unfortunately what we have seen since 2016 is that the person at the White House has used that diversity to divide us. He has used that diversity, those changing demographics, to pit communities against communities. And that's why I think you saw what happened in 2018 as a result of the governance since 2016, where you had so many of America's communities, what really makes up this country. You have it in Virginia. Terry saw it very, very well, and he spoke to everybody that was part of this great state, and that's what a real leader needs to do in terms of bringing everybody together. Unfortunately, what we have seen in the last 2 years is somebody who is only focused on speaking to probably about a fourth of the American electorate. And when that happens, it is very difficult to bring to the fore the kind of strength that America's diversity actually really is for the country.
Right, well, Trump's approval rating is at about 43, so that's a bit more than a fourth of it. And I think the partisan divide, whatever your opinion on the current president, clearly has been going on for a while. It didn't go from everyone loved each other to suddenly we've got this huge divide. Michael, I know in speaking to you earlier, very intelligent, very thoughtful person. I watched you on CNN recently, and it was the show that McCabe was interviewed, and the dynamics, since I'd spoken to you earlier in the day, I'm waiting. Finally, you got like one question in and enough time to describe him as being a liar in that, and that was, wasn't necessarily the thoughtful kind of discussion. Is it a function of the current state of the media and the medium that it's really contributing to this and preventing thoughtful discussion and common ground?
Well, I think I want to give Anderson Cooper some credit because that interview went long because he made some news that night. And I had actually flown in from Buffalo to New York to be on the panel and to give a 3-sentence answer and go back to Buffalo. Normally, I'd be a little bit upset about that, but that interview was supposed to be 30 minutes and it went 40, and there was a reason for it. But it didn't take me very long to call McCabe a liar. He's a liar. And I want to thank everybody here for having me. I really appreciate it. I haven't had this many microphones on me since I worked in Trump Tower. Come on, guys.
That's good stuff. They're laughing in the online version.
That's right. I go on CNN more than I do Fox and more than I do MSNBC. I do that because I've formed relationships with the people, the production team, the other contributors. I really like the battle of ideas. I come from Jack Kemp's office. We talked about it earlier. I was Jack Kemp's writer when I first came to Washington, and Jack always talked about the battle of ideas. And when I go on Fox, although I really enjoy a lot of those people, and some of them are old friends of mine, there's not so much of a battle of ideas for me. It would be it would be a battle for you. But when I get on CNN, I mix it up a bit, and I think that that's healthy. What's not healthy, and I think this is a difficult part, is the number of death threats that I get when I'm off the air via social media. My cell phone number is very easily found online because I was in public relations before the Trump campaign. People call and threaten me. I've had more than over 50 death threats. One person called and threatened to burn my house down with my children inside. Somehow he knew my children were inside. And I've had people arrested, and it always comes after I get off television.
That goes both ways.
It does, I know. And I'll tell you, we
I've
were
had the
talking.
same thing. I'm sure the governor has as well.
I was talking to a CBS correspondent earlier today. He's been getting it for 20 years. So I think the divide is difficult. I think that media sometimes makes it worse. But if I don't go on CNN, I feel like that my side's not being heard sometimes. And it's not as fun as, let's say, going to Fox and clinking glasses, but it's worth the battle.
Can I just say something here? Because we have this kind of discussion all the time, given what we're facing, right? But I just want to remind people that politics has always been rough and tumble. And while today we feel like we're at a moment where we're more divided than ever before, and I think that is the case to a certain extent, politics has always divided people. But I think the art of politics, and when people win, when people really win for the sake of leading and governing a country, is when they try to bring people together. Social media today, I think, also magnifies the divisions more than it does anything else, more than it does people agreeing on something. When Michael and I agree on the air, we don't get kudos from people because we're agreeing with each other, right?
Not one. Right.
Exactly. And so that, I think, is also something that we need to take into consideration. We're living and breathing this stuff because of social media, so it feels much more intense.
So when people talk money in politics, is a big part of that issue the money in creating this divide to drive ratings? That seems like a challenge. And I know, Michael, you said, quote, my side earlier. Colin Quinn recently wrote in an op-ed, the comedian, he's doing a show, Red State, Blue State, and he said, whatever happened to not being able to agree 100% with my party that I prefer? And Governor, do you want to share some thoughts and also the dynamic we're seeing play out on the media?
And I tried to allude to that earlier. No one's going to agree with everybody all the time. And I've tried to, and as governor of a state that, I went into office, it was a red state. I mean, all the statewide were Republicans before I won. I broke a 44-year trend to win. There were 32 Democrats out of 100 in my legislature in our House of Delegates. When I left office, we had picked up the most in 144 years. But when I went in, I had to work in a bipartisan way. I wasn't going to get anything done. Right. People actually want it. They want people to govern. And I try to keep out all the noise that goes on. And I always tried to appeal to everybody, especially the most rural communities. I mean, I was very proud. I took unemployment down 50% in every rural community. They didn't vote for me, but that didn't matter. I was governor for everybody.
Right.
And I think that made a lot of progress. But I agree, you got to reach out to all sides. When she would always put me on Fox. I mean, I went on Fox as chairman of the DNC 2 or 3 times a week.
That's right.
I loved it. And if you remember, some of the leadership of the House and Senate didn't like it that I was doing that. I said, that's nuts. Yeah. I mean, of course I want to get our message out. We're the thing, because they watch Fox, they're never going to vote Democrat. That was the craziest argument. That's right. At the top of the party, remember, gave us grief for doing it, which is nuts. But we're not always going to agree, and we want to get to a point where you have the best solutions and you can do it. It's just a lot of noise. You can't pay attention to it. I'm proud to say I never look at comments. I never have.
Smart.
Crazy.
That's
I
very
mean,
smart.
I got other things to do in my life than sit around. I got to get things done.
Your executive time was actually executive time.
Yes, I was working. No one ever
No.
questioned my.
That's right.
Not necessarily helpful for
yeah.
the discussion we're having.
I did not keep TVs
But
on.
kinda funny.
It was a good jibe. It was a good line. But we got to get to a point. The country is very split. I can tell you this as the governor who presided over Charlottesville. I've never seen anything worse in my life. It was a bad day for the president that day. I had spoken to him, told him what was going on. I mean, we had 1,000 people walking down the streets of Charlottesville, Virginia, screaming the worst and most vile things against African Americans and members of the Jewish faith, telling folks in front of the synagogue, we're going to burn you and burn you down like we did in Auschwitz. You know, people used to wear hoods to do this in this country. They don't feel they need to do it anymore. And it was a failure of the president on leadership when he came out and blamed both sides. It wasn't both sides. Heather Heyer died that day protesting against hatred. And we've got to get to a place in this country where we're back, bringing folks back together again. The divide we have is as great as I've ever seen it.
Yeah, and two of you are strategists as well, and you were a strategist in your earlier life, and this will relate to something Michael shared with me about him, in addition to political clients, also works some with other standard clients. In this case, it was about bringing a dance troupe, a ballet troupe, to the U.S., where suddenly you couldn't be involved in doing the promotion for that because that was actually getting in the way of having a dance troupe. So as strategists, if you can put your strategist hats on, how do corporations, how do brands navigate this where even association with smart people creates problems? Can the temperature be turned down on that?
It's interesting because what you were speaking about, I was one of the producers of a national touring ballet called Sleeping Beauty Dreams. This was after I appeared, well, actually, it was announced the same day I went before the Mueller investigation. And so my involvement became more important than the prima ballerina, who, by the way, was Russian. And the dance press were covering this, and the first questions they asked were about me and not Diana Vishneva, who was a brilliant dancer from the top troops in America and Russia. And at some point, we all got together and we realized that the questions about me were distracting from the production, and it was not lost on me that I had to lose a client because I knew too many Russians when everybody involved, the prima ballerina was Russian. But at the same time, where I would advise nobody in public relations and the representation side of it to be involved in politics ever again. I will never work for another campaign unless they legally indemnify me, because I lost so much by working for Donald Trump. It's ruined so much in my life and in my business. I would recommend nobody ever work in politics if you're going to work for a PR agency or a marketing agency. Don't do it. It'll kill you. But at the same, because most corporations, my clients are all law firms, burger chains, national touring ballets. They don't want to hear about politics.
Right.
And I had a burger chain that I was representing. People have figured out that I was their PR advisor. And so they started staging protests at the burger restaurants. I tried to tell my client, they don't even eat meat. Why do you care what they're saying, right? But I had to walk away from that one as well. But at the same time, while corporations are distancing themselves from politics, they're also embracing it. Yeah. You see Nike, which turned out to be a really bright move, embracing Colin Kaepernick. Yeah. And other corporations doing things that are completely right in the bullseye of politics. Right. So I think it goes from client to client and from PR advisor to PR advisor. Yeah. And there are certainly people, in the PR world who advise Nike and these other companies to go into the jackpot of politics.
I think that's exactly right. I think you can't really characterize it in one way, in one fell swoop with a broad brush. It's situational, and it's brand specific, and frankly, it's issue specific, and depending on the time that we're in. And the reason I say that is, for example, not too long ago, we saw Gillette come out with this commercial, right? Which ended up being supposedly very controversial. But it put them in a situation where they were seen as leaders on a really critical issue, the Me Too movement, Time's Up, et cetera. And from a strategic standpoint, I thought it was brilliant because a lot of people were talking about them. And that's a good thing in terms of a corporation coming out and making this gutsy move on an issue and putting them on the right side of it.
Yeah, and Governor, what's your take on brands increasingly being forced to engage or choosing to engage on important issues of times? At some point, going back, I recently visited the African American History Museum here in Washington. There was a time where the government was ahead of business in trying to force change. At this point, it seems businesses are almost ahead, at least in incorporating diversity and understanding the need for that to be successful. Not to say that there's not work left. What's your take on the brand
Well, I can tell you in the
positioning?
political world, in governance, the branding is so important. And listen, when I took office the year before I had come into office, Virginia had just passed the transvaginal bill, which made Virginia an absolute laughingstock in the nation. Rachel Maddow did shows every single night on it. Shutting the women's clinics down. That was a branding that literally decimated Virginia's ability to grow. You're not going to get Amazon, Google, Facebook, Microsoft, or Salesforce are not coming to your state if you discriminate against women, you discriminate against members of the LGBT community. So branding to a state, just look at what happened in North Carolina with HB2. They lost $3.63 billion. Right. I got CoStar, huge company, going to North Carolina. North Carolina's bid package was twice our size. They came. We've got 1,100 jobs in Richmond, Virginia. Average salary about $120,000. Huge win for us because of the HB2 bill. So the branding for the states and for governors, it's absolutely critical.
What about with this blackface controversy? How's that kill the brand?
Horrible. So by the time I left office, all of the horrible and the bills that I had to veto, that was all gone. Virginia was an open and welcoming state. We'd had a horrible racial history in Virginia. When I restored the felon rights, in 1902, a state senator by the name of Glass put an enfranchisement of felons in our Constitution. And his quote was, "I'm doing this to eliminate the darky from being a political factor in Virginia." That was his quote. Now I got to
What
stand.
year was that?
1902.
18 what?
No, 19.
1902.
Oh, okay.
And 114 years later, I got to reverse that. So the branding to states and open and welcoming. So, Virginia's for lovers, which was our slogan, which I used all over the globe. I would bring Virginia wine, 363 wineries. You should know that in Virginia, 287 craft breweries, 8 varieties of oysters. You eat our oysters, you drink our wine. Virginia's for lovers. You figure out the next step, I would say, to business groups all over the globe. And I got 1,142 companies to move to Virginia, 20 billion. So branding. But Michael, going to your point, sure. Anytime you have negative publicity, like what we've just gone through in Virginia with our 3 top leaders, is devastating for business. It really, it hurts. States.
You've been very clear on it.
Yeah.
You've been very clear all along.
Yeah, and Michael, thank you for bringing that up, because I was going to go there. You were, straight direct that people needed to move on, step aside. But is there a lesson now that if you're just combative, refuse to admit mistake, that's the pattern to remain in power? Because it's very difficult, to remove people. And people are saying maybe let the election be a decision, whether it's a national or it's a local. Virginia, clearly some issues that are problematic. Not to say you can look back and say, well, geez, the editor thought it was acceptable to put that stuff in the yearbook. Not that it was bad enough that they would do it, but who green lit that? It just demonstrates a mindset. So is a lesson that you just have to power through that if you want to survive in politics, just because the nature of intolerance and bad behavior as well?
Well, first of all, as governor, you're the leader of your state. And come with that, when you take that oath, there's a tremendous amount of responsibility. So you have a moral leadership as well. And the problem when your leaders face these types of issues, as I said, and I called for Ralph to resign on Friday, early, but when he came out on Friday night and said that he was in the photo, didn't know which one, and it was in his yearbook. So you either were blackface or you were Ku Klux Klansman.
Right.
and he very good. He was my lieutenant governor, and I picked him and had him go, and it was a very hard call for me. But to the point that you may have been in the picture and you didn't know which one you were.
Right.
You just can't be the moral leader of a state with a population 30% African American. You can't lead. You can't govern. And then it was the next day he came out and said he wasn't in it. Now, you're all talking crisis communications.
Right.
I'll give you a piece of advice.
Don't do that.
They shouldn't have said anything Friday
Right.
and waited till Saturday and said, it wasn't me.
Right.
I didn't put it in my yearbook.
Yeah.
I don't know why he didn't tell me that Friday night.
Right.
Right.
but put us in an untenable position on Friday. And baffling is all I can say.
Yeah, a little to dial it back related to some of the corporate issues. Amazon obviously announced they were opening new headquarters in New York and here in Virginia as well. Suddenly in New York, poof, that's disappeared. That involves corporate strategy, that involves political pressure and stress. I mean, what's your take? Is it a good thing? How do we better manage attracting business, if that's a good thing? I know you're pro-business of that, which
Oh my God,
I apologize for saying that. I know
Are you
that can
kidding
be
me? I mean,
tricky.
this is the biggest announcement for any state in the history of their states. And I put the bid in. It happened while I was still governor. $1.83 billion bid. It was a great bid. We won it. We are now getting 25,000. And now for sure we're going to get the additional jobs to take us up to 37,000 at 150,000 average salary, minimum average salary. For the life of me, what New York did is unconscionable. This was a generational change for the state of New York. They're very reliant. They got finance, they got real estate, they got a lot of foreign investment in real estate. They need to diversify, just as because of defense and sequestration in Virginia, we need to diversify. This is the dumbest political thing I have ever seen in my life. And if I'm a voter in New York, I would be outraged. Do you know? Over 25 years, it was going to net return $27.3 billion to the state of New York and the city. That is $27 billion. You get to build schools and pay teachers and do roads. It is beyond how that happened. Yeah. Now, when I put the bid in, I had all my legislators. We worked with my local community. We were all in. Mm-hmm. I had no idea New York, but someone should pay a huge price because there are families, $150,000 minimum salary. It was a game changer for the state of New York, and they blew it.
Yeah, the cousin of one of my employees owns an Italian restaurant in the area. They were planning expansion. They were going to open up for lunch, serve more meals, grow out their space. And
unions lost 11,000 jobs for construction. It's just unbelievable.
Yeah.
As a New York resident, New York voter, and as someone who's run a campaign against Andrew Cuomo, I can tell you that the people who are in politics and elected office who messed that up are in for a world of hurt from Andrew Cuomo.
I can only imagine.
Yeah.
He really worked hard to get that in there. I'm not a big fan of the governor, but we really needed those jobs in our state.
Yep.
And the idea that they were run off, I believe that. But I also believe, and I have some information that indicates that it's true, that they started looking at what kind of business it is. I mean, what it's like to do business in New York and the actual costs of doing business. And there's a reason why New York State is number 49 as a place where, 49th good place to do business. And Virginia is far higher up there. And I got to believe that politics played part of it, that the statements against Amazon were stinging, but at the same time, it's a lot better to do business, a lot easier to do business in Virginia than it is in New York.
Yeah, well, New York also had the setup where one state senator appointed to a commission could veto it. And once an anti-Amazon person got that spot, that's when Amazon quickly reversed. We're going to get to your
Let me just say, their bid was $3 billion, just so people understand. $3 billion was the New York bid. They were going to net $27 billion. But of the $3 billion, 90% of the $3 billion came from two funds, the Excelsior Fund for Job Creation, and then the city had it. That had nothing to do with Amazon. Yeah. It could have been X, Y, or Z corporation.
And it will
You're
be.
entitled to those funds no matter who you are. So the idea that this was a big thing, anyone would have gotten it. There was about a $558 million of direct, which we did as well in Virginia, of direct, which didn't go out until the tax dollars came in, so there was zero risk.
Yeah.
And this idea that they were giving them $3 billion, it was just false.
Yeah, and just to let the tech people know, we'll be moving on to the next panel shortly. And before we get to your final thoughts, I want to throw this out to anyone who wants to respond on the panel. Any of you thinking of running for president in 2020 and you'd like to make a statement about that?
Oh,
here?
I want Maria, come on, you got to tell them.
You know, I would announce right now, except for the fact that I was not born in this country. So you'd have to change the Constitution in order for me to do so.
You and Jennifer Granholm.
That's right.
Do
and
you-
Arnold,
Do you know
Arnold.
anybody? Did you used to work for anybody who might run for president?
maybe. No, we actually were talking about this earlier. And, you know, as a member of the DNC, I'm one of those so-called superdelegates. We passed some very stringent rules this time around to make sure that not even the perception of the DNC or anybody in the committee putting their thumb on the scale was going to be an issue this time around. Superdelegates do not get a vote on the first ballot. Superdelegates can endorse if they want to, but right now, because the field is so open wide, and I'm actually looking forward to this debate of ideas that we've been talking about, I think it's wonderful that we have so many people with so many diverse experiences and backgrounds, and they span the spectrum of the Democratic Party. It is going to be a robust and I think very, very interesting debate. And what we have as a party, which is what I am so proud of, and it's going to be interesting to see what happens on the Republican side, the things that we are debating are how to give more people access to health care and how we do that, how we give more people access to quality education versus the other side that is trying to figure out how we take away access to health care. And so I think that is going to be a very specific difference between the parties that Americans are going to be able to see.
Great. And Michael Caputo, we understand you're not running for president, but do want to give you a chance just to maybe suggest some thoughts on how to bridge the divide and sort of a tight final thought. And Governor, we'll give you the last word and then move to the next.
Because I really want to hear his answer to the last question. Everything has changed. It has. It used to be that, for example, I mean, you're going to do a legal panel, which I'm sure will answer this question, where you didn't say anything against your judge. You didn't post anything on Instagram. You didn't say anything against the prosecutors because there are a million reasons to do that. And those concepts are gone. And they are gone forever probably. And they have left in the last 3 years. I brought this up here because I wanted to, this is not my book, this is Kendall Coffey's book. He was a U.S. attorney appointed under Bill Clinton in the Southern District of New York called Spinning the Law. And he has to rewrite this book, chapters of it, because of what's happened in the last 3 years, bridging the divide. It used to be, Kendall told me, that his father told him that if you oppose somebody or somebody is against you, then make sure everybody knows. Now, his father was apparently well before his time. Kendall's a little older than me, so his father was well before his time. Now, bridging the divide has to overcome that concept that from here forward, all of us, if you're communicating clearly in order to win something that's important, whether it's a court case, a seat at the table, or a location for your corporation, people are going to start, like the president, like other people are now, defining who is their enemy loudly, opposing prosecutors loudly, and even criticizing your judge. And that's going to be very difficult to overcome for those of us who are in communications.
Great, and that's an awesome lead into the next panel. Governor, any announcements you'd like to share?
I'm not sure this is the venue if I do what I do, but for Mark, I'll do it for Mark. But listen, it's going to be, I agree with Maria, it's going to be, on the Democratic side, a big, healthy, competitive. It's a good thing. When I ran the party in 2004, we had a huge field. It's actually good to get a lot of those ideas out. But we got to make sure, and I wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post a couple weeks ago, which generated a lot of press. And my point is, I'm for big, bold, aggressive ideas. But we also got to have a realistic agenda out there. And I don't want to see us as a party putting things out there that really have no chance of becoming reality. I didn't do that when I ran for governor. I put a lot of big ideas, had a binder this big. I got about 96% of what I wanted, and I promised by the time I left office. And you have the president today with the Washington Post, fact checks, 18 lies a day. People are numb today in this country. And we can't just say things out there which have no reality of becoming something actual as a policy. So this is, and I think the press has to do a much better job than they've done in the past, and they did in 2016. I think people got away with a lot of things in 2016 that shouldn't have been allowed. And I think the candidates have got to come out with good, positive, realistic agendas of where we need to go. I come from that place that big, bold ideas, but also realistic things that will happen. My guesstimate is there'll be 3, 4, or 5 more Democrats getting in on the Democratic side. It's going to be a good, healthy field. I tell Democrats all the time, don't think it's going to be easy to beat Donald Trump. You will do that at your peril.
I do the same.
You got to run a very good, strong campaign. You got to be able to take him on the issues. We'll see where the economy is. We'll see what the Mueller report comes out with. But this, the final thing I'll say is 92 million Americans did not vote in 2016. 92 million. Hillary lost 3 states, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, by 77,000 votes. But 92 million people stayed home. And I don't think that's going to happen again. I think a good percentage, maybe it's 30%, are going to come out who didn't vote. You saw it in Virginia in 17, the biggest wins in 140 years. You saw it last year, the biggest wins that we had since 1974 in the House and the Senate. You're going to have a huge turnout. But getting our party back together after the primaries, as you know, is not the easiest thing, and we're going to have to do that. But I do think the motivating factor for Democrats is beating Trump, and I think that will be a great unifying message.
So that's a yes? That's a yes?
Time will tell. Maybe we'll answer it by this, but I do have to move it forward because thanks to this phenomenal panel, Governor, Maria, Michael, and Feel Better. Appreciate you coming despite that fender bender. Thanks so much. Next up, we've got a short video, and that's going to feature Michael Zeldin of CNN and author and open government advocate Alex Howard as we'll get ready for our next panel talking about the intersection of law and public relations. Stay with us on Truth and Trial. Roll it. Michael Zeldin is a veteran of Truth on Trial and legal analyst for CNN. In these roles, he's at the intersection of many of the issues dominating coverage today. Thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
So as part of the media, do you ever feel pressure or are you encouraged to create conflict with some of the panels you're on to make sure there's a combative environment to help drive ratings?
No, not at all. In fact, in my tenure with CNN, the guidance has always been be factually based, have a point of view, articulate that point of view to inform our audience. There was no effort to be theatrical, to drive discord when no discord is warranted.
Let's look at PR people, communicators within brands, within nonprofits. How do they need to be acting, with the legal teams at these organizations to have the best outcomes?
So there are 2 different ways in which it arises. In the ordinary course, where there is no controversy, I think that the PR people can effectively work, not siloed in PR, but not embedded in the general counsel's office, though the message that they want to convey should be, I think, reviewed and approved by general counsel's office so they don't say anything that will get the company in legal trouble. In times of crisis, when your boat hits an iceberg, then the PR people and the general counsel people really need to be embedded in a single team, mindful of attorney-client privilege and other things that could be waived in such a singular team. But I think that that crisis management message has to be very closely coordinated between legal and public relations.
Yeah, and we've increasingly in the political sphere, we've seen lawyers almost taking on the role of spokespeople for their clients. Might that happen within the brand environment as well? And could that be some cause for concern or a positive development?
Well, I don't think it's necessary in a well-baby environment where there's no illness that we're seeking to treat. I think that the PR professionals are really quite capable of divining the message with C-suite people, with sort of review finally by counsel before it is made public. It's just that crisis area where I think a different modality needs to be followed.
Awesome. Thanks so much for your time. We really enjoy it and appreciate it. I'm here with Alex Howard, an open government advocate and author. I should let the audience know we're recording this on February 22nd, Washington's birthday, historic day for honesty in the country. What's your take? How much of the Mueller report will be released to the public?
Well, there's nothing barring the entire thing from being released under the statute. They're required to share it with Congress. Congress could then share it. I think that they should share all of it. Public trust in this administration is at historic lows. The world is trying to understand what happened. I don't think that we'll be well served if it's not. What I expect to happen is that we're going to see a legal battle. I think that we're going to see Congress do what it can in the House to get it out. You're going to see delaying efforts in the Senate. It's going to be portrayed as partisan, but I would hope that people would look beyond that and think what the public's right to know is. And my expectation is that one way or another, we actually will see something. Whether it's the entire thing, it remains to be seen, because there are going to be classified aspects of this.
If we're still good to go, I guess we'll jump right back into it. We've got a terrific panel going right now. Seated to my right in order, we've got Ty Cobb. He served as special counsel to President Donald Trump, widely recognized as one of the premier white-collar Securities and Exchange Commission enforcement and congressional investigation lawyers in the world, as we covered in a previous Truth on Trial event. Ty's gone through periods being hated by members of either party in his careers as he worked with people across the political spectrum. Next to Ty is Stefan Passantino. He's chair of Michael Best's Government and Regulations and Public Policy Practice, in addition to having been a former White House counsel. We're lucky moving down the aisle to have Suzanne Rich Folsom. She's an award-winning general counsel and chief compliance officer, having served in leadership roles at U.S. Steel, AIG, and the World Bank. And you've got great experience coming in and cleaning up messes as well. So
right.
get anyone as a
AIG after the crisis.
AIG after the crisis. That's a good point to clarify. Yeah, she's one of the good people who's like, uh-oh, we've got this going. How do we fix it? And Richard Levick, chairman, CEO of Levick Communications. And under his leadership, Levick has set new standards in global communication, brand protection, and you're an advocate for strategic initiatives required by companies in today's perilous business landscape. Lots of news that's happening, touching on the intersection of legal and communications that we'll get into. And the first one, the Mueller report, is rumored to be issued very soon. I use the word issued lightly because a big question is who's going to get to see it. Obviously, Ty and Stefan, without violating any attorney-client relationships that you've had in your previous work, in the interest of public trust, do you think it should be made as public and available as possible, especially to exonerate people perhaps falsely accused?
I think there should be as much transparency as possible, but it comes in a very strict legal setting. During the Clinton administration, the Hill and the president let the old Independent Counsel Act lapse. They replaced it with a Special Counsel Act in 1999, and that is much more rigorous in terms of the process. The process is pretty simple. The report gets submitted confidentially. A report gets submitted confidentially. It could be 5 pages, it could be 200, but it goes confidentially to the Attorney General. The Attorney General is only obligated to communicate the fact that he's received the report, and if there has been an instance where the Justice Department took or refused to permit the special counsel to take an action that he wanted to take, then the Attorney General has to report that to Congress as well and explain. There's no obligation to make the report public. There is a public interest consideration, but it doesn't generate any rights for either Congress or individuals in court. It can't be litigated because there are no rights created out of that act. So Congress could subpoena it. It would be subject to executive privilege claims should the administration want to do it. My guess is that whatever is presented by the Justice Department will be unsatisfactory to certainly the Democrats, likely the press, and there'll be constant pressure to do it. There's also the possibility of leaks.
If I can maybe add to that, sort of from the perspective of the folks who were working in the White House and having been the deputy White House counsel at the time, everyone sort of innately understands this desire for the transparency. Let's put everything out. The public has a right to know. We want to make sure we have all of the facts that are out there. That's all something that there's a great deal of clamor for. But one does also have to look at the fact that the process through which the Mueller probe was able to generate the information that it has is a little different from the normal process in that a lot of it was very compulsory. Everyone likes reading a Bob Woodward book, or everyone likes reading the books where you're going to get various different people coming forward, giving various anecdotes. Those sources have some degree of control. Am I going to go on the record? Am I going to not talk to this reporter? Am I going to be on some form of background or whatever to put whatever story out there? It doesn't work that way with the special counsel. If you get a phone call from the special counsel's team and says, we would like to talk to you, you are going to go in and talk to that person. Doesn't have to be, as Ty very ably helped all of us, doesn't have to be necessarily compulsory, but you are going to go in and talk, and you are going to answer those questions. If you then have a mechanism whereby you have absolute mandatory compulsory discussion of every last minutia, and then it's all just going to get put out there, whether or not it results in an indictable information or other things, it does actually create an incredible chilling effect to a large extent on people's ability to do these kind of jobs or otherwise control a narrative. So there is this flip side of the government has the ability to obtain massive amounts of information that normally people would think of as either private or not necessarily what you'd want to get out. And just say, well, we're just going to put all of it out there regardless of whether it results in anything that's actionable. That's something that there is a natural tension on.
Right, I guess, so where do we put it if it's from all of it out there is one extreme, and I think most reasonable people would agree that, okay, there might be certain things that should be redacted from that. But is it, at a time, the session's called Truth on Trial, lacking transparency with truth so debatable, so fungible these days, isn't it in the national interest to try and get as much out as possible? And Suzanne and Richard, I'll let you guys weigh in on this in a moment.
But, well, there's some difficulty with that, which is, I've read recently people saying, well, you can go the Leon Jaworski route or the Ken Starr route and, have a short report or a, multi-volume treatise. But the reality is there are legal considerations, and there are two statutes that, in particular, that directly affect what can be released. One involves grand jury secrecy. One involves, the discretion of the Attorney General in connection with however he wants to summarize or put something out. Would he do the report with redactions? I doubt that. I think it'd be more likely to be a Justice Department summary of the findings if he did that. But you just don't know, and so and this gets into the issue of people complaining about Starr and the ability to put that report out there and all the passion that was ginned up at that stage of the game that forced the new statute, which was designed to pull back on that, and that's the
because no granular
legal
detail was
restriction.
left uncovered in the Starr report.
Right, and Bob has done. Bob Mueller has done effective job, I believe, in the indictments and sentencing memos of telling the story that he has. So it's not necessarily that there aren't a lot of facts already out there. It's just on everybody's collusion meter, they want to see where things land, and I'm not sure. I'm not sure that everybody's going to be satisfied on that.
Right, yeah, it sounds like it'll be challenging. Suzanne, Richard, do you want to weigh in with your perspective?
Well, thank you, Suzanne. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. I don't know
Pass
if
to
you
you,
could
Richard.
see, and for those people who are just watching on television or on the webcast, they can see Suzanne's hand like, please, go ahead. Disagree with these two presidential counsel and go at it, have fun. And I can't wait to see who's paying for dinner later. But, a couple of thoughts. One, that Doug, you make the point that, and I'm not, as a non-practicing lawyer, I'm certainly not going to take issue with anything that the President's counsel have identified here, both because I'm incapable and also for no particularly good reason. But we assume that transparency, by definition, isn't necessarily better. It's not. I think, one, if we look at Ken Starr's motivation, it was legal. He was so shocked by the behavior of the president that he thought the country would be shocked, and that alone would be enough to tip the United States Congress to impeachment. The question I think we have to ask ourselves, which is, if you think transparency is good now, will it be good when there's a Democrat who's president, who will be investigated. There is no question. If anything has gotten extraordinary endorsement, is the use of special counsel, which can go in any direction they so choose. And just be aware, it's got to be good. What's good for the goose has to be good for the gander. Part of my concern already we're seeing on the House side, and I will say I think we have 3 Republicans and the lone Democrat here, but I will say that it concerns me if the House, now in Democratic hands, is already thinking about restricting rights to counsel for witnesses at hearings. That may work when you're in the majority, but I'm not sure how well it's going to work when you're not. And I would take that down, which is to a personal level. If we're going to exist in this intoxication of too much information environment, where we're all rushing to conclusions before we have information, we have to be able to look in the mirror and appreciate that we have the right to change our minds or to view things differently, and we can't be outcome determinative. We don't like Donald Trump, therefore the rules of transparency apply. Oh, but if we do like the president, not so sure how I feel about transparency.
Suzanne?
I think from a corporate America perspective, people would just like this to be done, whichever way, and because corporations are concerned about creating shareholder value. And at the end of the day, it's interesting when you leave the Beltway, and for me, having spent so much of my career here and then having gone outside to work in corporations, it's amazing how little attention the rest of America pays to issues going on in Washington. So I think people would just like a resolution one way or the other.
Yeah, unfortunately, it sounds like it's not going to be a clean resolution, and this is something that's
Right.
going to go on going. Now the battle will turn to what's the information we can get and go there. We could bog down the whole conversation with this, and not to diminish its importance, I want to just get into another area that's interesting from a law and public relations perspective that we'll be getting into with our next group, and this is sort of a Doug theory perspective. Tell me if I'm right or wrong, but I see on TV Michael Avenatti, Rudy Giuliani, Lanny Davis. They don't seem to me to be acting as attorneys in that role, but as public relations spokespeople. And this also happens within corporations. So what are the implications of, quote, lawyers becoming PR spokespeople? And does that have an issue with, does that mess with attorney-client privilege? What can they say? What should they say? What shouldn't they? Where do they sort of draw that line?
There are very real dangers when you do that, as Lanny Davis found out recently when he misled the country with regard to certain facts that Cohen would allegedly testify to, and he had to walk it back. Clearly didn't have his client's authority to say it. Turned out not to be true. When he makes statements like that, he's acting as an agent, so it could be used against Cohen. I think that you see lawyers get out, as was said well in the earlier panel, that the day of letting the story come to you is over. You got to get out and manage the story. You've got to, and you need to do it very professionally. Try to limit the facts, make it clear what the process is, and be accurate. And one of the most important things is, as the governor said, and as is highlighted by the Virginia situation, is you have to master the facts immediately before you talk. Because putting out a palliative, that's not going to help you. You need to be able to make a forceful statement that's factual and will stand up under scrutiny. You can't have a changing story or you bury yourself.
I think it's helpful to add, too, that especially for the purposes of this panel, as a lawyer, the natural instinct as a lawyer is, as Ty was just saying, let's go underground, nobody says anything, counsel your clients, you're not going to talk, we're not going to put anything in. That's the lawyer's natural instinct. When you're dealing with a hyper-intense media environment where there are numerous angles and there are numerous different agendas out there from media, from opponents, from watchdog groups, from whoever, all of whom are going to pounce on anything and try to frame a narrative in a way that does not necessarily suit your client's advantage at all, you do not have the ability to take the normal legal instinct and say, we're going to shut down. So as a lawyer, you have to be in that environment, or that intensity that we had, which between the White House counsel's office called a Tuesday. Usually that was sort of every day the way that it was. But there is a key concept to understand. As a lawyer, there are very important other principles. Attorney-client privilege, phenomenally important principle, subject to waiver under the right circumstances. Also, as I think in some of the circumstances we've talked about before, as a lawyer, you must engage, but you owe a fiduciary duty to the interests of your client. And it's very, very, very easy for lawyers who think that they're out promoting the interests of their client to sometimes lose sight in the fight, the rough and tumble of the fight, of the fact I have one job, and that is under no circumstances am I to do harm to my client, even if it is in my own personal interest to go down a certain path. And so it's very, very perilous for lawyers to try to become amateur PR professionals under those kinds of circumstances, but you also don't have the luxury of doing nothing.
Well, and another very important thing that I put into play in my private practice when I represented controversial clients or boards in crises, you want to have Richard Levick on speed dial.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and that's an important point we were discussing earlier about the connectivity between the PR representation and the legal so they can fully understand the nuances. That's important. So I guess bad news from the earlier panel that all the PR people should renounce their political clients, but now good news that the company should still call you in times of crisis, so we're trying to balance it out. Suzanne, you had said some interesting things when I was speaking with you earlier about what are some of the legal issues that brands, nonprofits will be facing coming up. Two you pointed out of special importance are cybersecurity and privacy issues. You want to talk like how do brands sort of protect themselves from what might be coming down the pike, and Richard, you as well, and then we'll get some issues inside companies and how to navigate and manage them before we get to our final media and communications panel.
Before I touch on that, I just wanted to say that I think it's really important that within the corporation that legal be involved from the beginning. And I think that many corporations that have not found themselves in crisis haven't had legal involved. So when the crisis hits, they don't automatically think to go to legal. So you'd be amazed at how many Fortune 500 companies don't have crisis communications plans, or if they do have one, it's really very basic. So I think it's really important that legal be involved. I think the other point is that with respect to communications, where do they report within the corporation? And that's really important. I personally don't think HR, which is where most corporate communications teams report, is necessarily the best, especially if a crisis hits. So if they don't report to the CEO, they should report to legal, because so many of the issues that you're dealing with have legal ramifications. So you've had a cyber attack. How do you handle that? You're going to need legal involved. You know, there's privacy issues with whatever was exfiltrated. You know, you need to have legal involved. And in those initial couple of hours, if legal's not involved, there can be some really serious mistakes made by the corporation that could cause additional legal trouble down the road beyond whatever the initial breach or problem was. So for cyber and privacy, every corporation, no matter who you are, your company has something of value. So somebody may think you're a steel company, you know, what do you have of value that everybody has something of value that's going to be exfiltrated at some point or has. So legal needs to be involved there.
Yeah, I always tell clients that the first 48 hours are essential because that is where 90% of the mistakes in case management happen. And Suzanne, I know from her compliance background, you know, has seen this, that, you know, there will be 20 conversations that don't involve legal, all of which are subject to, you know, a lack of privilege, and people would have to testify about it. So getting legal in immediately to preserve the privilege and to ensure that nobody screws anything up and the documents are preserved and that the company, you know, acts honorably. Whatever's happened in the past, that they act honorably from that, you know, the first sign of an investigation forward.
Yeah. Richard, also?
I just want to say one other thing, and I think it's also important that before the crisis happens, that you're running your red team drills. I mean, you know, people are doing things with respect to, you know, safety. They should also be doing it with respect to other areas that could cause reputational damage, you know, to the corporation. You should be running ahead of time. Richard and Ty, I've had the good fortune in more than one company in crisis to work with and have their outside counsel. AIG was one. We had the main crisis going on, but we were red teaming the entire time all other types of crisis situations that we could have. And I think 9 out of 10 of them, unfortunately, ended up happening. But we were prepared for them in the midst of the bigger crisis.
I want to add also, though, that the corollary to the notion that, okay, all communicators must work with counsel, very valid, but the flip to that is counsel also needs to understand when you are working with the communications team, you cannot tell the communications team to run dark. You cannot. If you don't actually set the narrative in those first 48 hours, that is set in the mind of the public. And it is extraordinarily difficult to undo that initial presumption. And so I would say it's just as incumbent to make sure that counsel understands you are going to be putting a narrative out there, whether you like it or not. It's got to be accurate. It's got to make sure that you don't put anything false out there. But you cannot do the normal legal instinct and just say, we're just going to let this thing sit and we'll see how this thing plays out.
Right, and Richard, you had a comment, and then we'll get to a couple more quick questions from each of you to move on to the next panel. We started a few minutes late, so we'll be extending the time for all stations down the line carrying the programming. They should be aware, Richard.
So thank you. The Heidi Bowl revisited. So a few thoughts here. One, just to touch on the point that everyone is making in terms of the teamwork. When we were doing crisis work 2 decades ago, very few people said they do crisis work. Now every PR firm that's ever handled a slip and fall says they do crisis, and there are a number of great firms here that are going to be on the next panel. We work very closely, with the folks from Edelman and some of the other great firms. But there are lots of firms all over the country who don't have their experience and don't haven't handled the kinds of matters. When Suzanne is talking about the first 48 hours, most matters are not single jurisdiction. They're multi-jurisdictional. And so now you've got a problem where, like with TARP, it's per se illegal in 2 countries, in Singapore and Mexico, but it's of course legal in the United States. How are you going to handle it from a legal point of view? How are you going to handle it from a communications point of view? Because someone's not going to be happy. And so it's not just that it's rote that you're required to have the relationship. You have to have a trusted and close relationship now. And because things move so quickly, you have to be proactive. You have to know and trust each other. Next, to the question you asked about Lanny and Rudy and Michael Avenatti, look, we've represented over 300 law firms around the world in high-profile matters, and I've known Lanny for 30 or 35 years. I still can't figure out what he's doing. In the morning he's PR, in the afternoon he's lawyer. From a privilege point of view, I'm always confused by that. And for Michael Avenatti, quite frankly, when he announces during Stormy Daniels and in between the Kavanaugh hearings that he's thinking about running for president, I'm really concerned about the position that the clients have with him, because they sound like they're stepping stones as opposed to the most important people in the room. And then finally, I think we are in an age of mercantile activism. Suzanne talked a little bit about it, but corporations historically have wanted to avoid being in the limelight by being political. There have always been a few exceptions, but almost always. We're past that time. We now, Airbnb is going to weigh in on Brexit, and we have WeWork is going to weigh in on vegetarianism, not, by the way, on SoftBank. How fascinating, right after the Jamal Khashoggi assassination, since 70% of WeWork's money comes from Saudi Arabia. But fascinating that they would weigh in on that and therefore be unable to weigh in once again. And so the list goes on and on. I think Nike's position and being so political is very, very smart, but very scientific. They knew exactly where their dollars were coming from, and so it was very, very thoughtful. But I think if companies think that they're going to be able to avoid being political, that is no longer a viable option. It's no longer just your CSR or what you're selling or your brand. It's where you're communicating. It's who's in your advertisements. It's whether or not you pull your ads fast enough from some anchor who has offended another group. So you have to be extremely thoughtful. And again, that gets us back to the requirement of teams. And the most challenging issue for us now, particularly for companies that are AIG size, how are we going to exist in a post-silo world? HR, GR, PR, For 70 years, they've existed fine in their own silos. We are post-silo. How do you create integrated teams that know and trust each other? I don't know the answer to that. I just know it's necessary.
Great, and because Richard mentioned the New York Jets and the Heidi Bowl piece, I will bring up, C-suite bad behavior for one final thought with Robert Kraft as a recent example, Elon Musk tweeting out questionably valid information to move the market. How do PR folks, and just if you can give a quick thought on that to wrap up and we'll move on to the next panel after, how do PR folks, bridge the gap and prepare for that? Is it about doing better due diligence? Me Too fits under there. How do you get the better information to protect your brand?
Well, it clearly starts before it happens. And so from a compliance standpoint, and that falls with legal, that falls with PR, that falls on all these, there is no substitute for making sure that folks understand what the rules are in advance. You've done some degree of training, you've really reinforced those notions. And then you're sort of there. And once it happens, you better hope that the systems in place can start moving effectively.
No, I agree 100% with that. I mean, you can't really prepare for something like the Robert Kraft thing. You need to go straight to well-trained people and hope they do their best work, because it's not something that you plan for. But the teamwork is essential. People have been trying to get this formula right for 2 decades. People move too fast sometimes. People move too slow. That's why you have to have the red team drills. Figure that out. And facts rule. Facts rule. I mean, so take the Jussie Smollett event. People who moved in too fast and were too judgmental, obviously have some egg on their face. It's understandable. It's not a reason to crucify anybody, but getting your facts right and maybe waiting a day for the police to
and we'll get to that with the news cycle with the next group.
And the same thing on a Me Too, a Les Moonves type thing. You have to. It's something where people need to understand, even if you don't have an answer, you're taking it seriously.
Right, and Suzanne, maybe the issue of making it easier for whistleblowers to come forward within organizations to sort of nip that kind of behavior in the bud, as you were mentioning earlier, maybe can play a role. What's your last piece of advice?
Sure. Well, I think that the role of the legal department in corporations is changing, and it's changed in the past 10 years, and it's expanded. But more importantly, I think the type of people that you hire into that legal department, you need to have lawyers that have had other experiences beyond just being a lawyer, that have had compliance experiences, government, have worked in different situations. The model before of going to college, law school, maybe a firm and into the corporation. And that becomes really important because a point that was made earlier by both Ty and Stefan, that you need lawyers that aren't just going to shut things down,
right?
But they need to have had those experiences to be able to inform their ability to work better with the communications people. So yes, you need to have the right policies for whistleblowers, but I think most big corporations out there have those policies. It's a question of whether the corporation really practices what it preaches with the documents, and many still do not.
Richard?
We have now, for the first time in our lives, we are existing in a democracy, not a republic, a democracy. Every bit as what Thomas Jefferson and others would argue Andrew Jackson envisioned, not what John Adams envisioned, where we didn't have direct election of senators. We certainly didn't have the kind of impact that we had. I think the tragic and larger question for us right now is, how capable are we, each of us, of existing in a democracy? We are so willing to be so judgmental so quickly. As someone who, as a 6-year-old, remembers listening to Martin Luther King and hear white critics on radio, and as a 6-year-old being offended and impacted, and then a couple years later, after his assassination, hearing those same white people talk about, oh, what a great leader he was. Like, now that he's a martyr, he's safe, and we can say nice things. And as an 8-year-old being offended by that. And yet to see the rush to judgment now on Jussie Smollett, to see a Me Too movement in which, and I know I'm saying all these unpopular things here, in which my master's thesis was on pay equity and the history of the women's rights movement. and yet sometimes seeing that movement being used for power and not justice. Or, as I remarked earlier about how the Democrats are already trying to change some of the rules, and so it's about power and not righteousness. It's really, really hard, as Winston Churchill said, that democracy is the least form of government except for all the others. And I think our jobs, all of our jobs, it's not about spin. Our jobs is about a race to the truth. How do we get truth out there? And I think we need to exist in a society where just because we have access to Facebook and other social media and that we can weigh in instantly without the facts doesn't mean that we should. And when we look at Facebook, we're concerned enough that they may have inappropriately allowed the Russians to be involved in our elections, and India, and the Philippines, and in Myanmar, for God's sakes, where it was used for the murder of 46,000 people, in excess of 46,000 people. These are really, really serious issues, which none of us should leave here feeling great that we have the answer because we're in power, but because we have to figure out how to deal with this, and we need to remember this, and the governor's not here anymore, this is the great experiment. Democracy is a great experiment, and we have to earn it every day.
Great. Thank you so much for your thoughtful contributions. Great stuff. We're going to move on to the next video, which has some interesting perspectives from Frank Sesno, former Washington bureau chief of CNN, and David Rear was professor of public policy here at the Schar School. Thanks so much, Ty, Stefan, Suzanne, and Richard. Great stuff. Frank Sesno is director of the School of Media and Public Affairs at George Washington University. So now that you're not at CNN, are you still spending time watching the cable network news shows in the evening?
Oh, of course. You never stray too far from your roots. I watch CNN. I watch the other cable channels. I watch them both to know what's going on, but also to see how they are reporting and how they are reflecting this very strange and unique political and social environment we find ourselves in.
Yeah, so what's been your takeaway? Are you pleased with what you're seeing?
Not especially. I think there's more opinion and less information than I would like. There's much less what I call explanatory journalism than I would like. There is more blurring of reporting and opinion than I would like. But this is what the audience demands. That's what these networks will tell you, all of them. It certainly is where the numbers are. Their focus on Donald Trump at this particular time is what the audience demands, but I believe it sells short an awful lot of other things that are happening in the world and in politics, for that matter, that people should know about.
Yeah, so does the media have a responsibility to try and bring people more together?
Do the media have a responsibility to bring people together? Right. No, I don't think they have a responsibility to bring people together. I think that is in many cases, if not all cases, part of what journalism traditionally should be, because you bring people together, if you can think of it that way, around the truth. You bring people together around a set of facts. That is their responsibility.
Yeah, and because of the divide, the truth is often debatable. What are some of the implications for PR folk, for communicators at brands and nonprofits because of this political divide?
Brands and nonprofits live in the same world the rest of us live in. They operate in the same environment and certainly media ecosystem that every political player operates in. It's a public sphere. It's a digital sphere where accusations and conspiracies will often travel faster and with more impact than truth and science, as an example. And so recognizing that is critical, recognizing that people in a very polarized time will walk around with some strong belief sets, and they may be inclined to follow their gut before they stop and, provide new rational thought or take the time to absorb new information. So I think what everybody in nonprofits and any brand has to appreciate is it's rapid fire information, it's rapid fire decision making, often driven now more by ideology and polarization. As people hang out with others who feel as they do, that can reinforce those things. So it makes messaging more complicated, but much more important.
Great. Thanks so much for spending time with us. Really great insights.
Pleasure.
Given the intensity of divided and less predictable government, how can advocacy be effective these days?
I think advocacy in today's environment has to be authentic, has to be anticipatory and has to kind of understand the perspective of the person that they're going to advocate before, even more so than in past days.
CEOs at associations, very important. How do they cut through the clutter and build their brands in this environment?
Well, there is a tendency, I think, among associations to be similar. And in this environment, you have to be unique. You have to, it's mentioned by a lot of people, but you have to really think out of the box. How do you grab someone's attention? And then how do you hold it? And how do you then communicate the story in an ongoing way? Number two, then thinking about how they differentiate themselves and their brand or their good or their service or what their association does. And then three, do that in a way that's easily remembered.
Great. So now we are back, and now that most of the other panels have left, I can say, and be honest with you, we've saved our best for last. So seated next to me, I've got Lisa Osborne-Ross, who's president of Edelman DC. Congratulations for that. Peter Carson, managing director of public affairs of North America for Weber Shandwick and Powell Tate. Stephen Pearlston, who's been a business reporter for the Washington Post and is now a columnist, and Gabriele De Benedetti, national correspondent for New York Magazine. Among his credits was reporting on the Hillary Clinton campaign for about 3 years when he was with Politico. So now we're going to tie everything up and find solutions for our audience of communicators who are out there, because the problems aren't too big. Interesting, Larry Fink's letter, the famous one from BlackRock, about purpose and profit having to be tied together. Lisa, how important is it for brands to have a purpose, and how do you help execute that as a counselor for them?
One, it's a necessity, and the beauty of being the last is not only are we the best, but we do have a chance to be judgy and evaluate and think about and talk about what our predecessors said.
Yeah.
So I was struck by the fact that everyone, on both panels, they gave Nike as an example. And I was struck by the fact that in talking about this, there was this concept that people were being, or CEOs were being political. We don't see that as being political, we see that as being human. It is a matter of, we are now working in an environment where the people that we work with, the people that buy our products and services are activists, and they have an opinion, and they express their opinion. Some of our data talks about the fact that 70% either buy or boycott based on how they feel about your brand. And so it is, it's not political. It's human, it's natural to have a point of view, to express your purpose, to explain what your purpose is, and to make sure that your stakeholders and your customers know that. So it is a necessity, and you actually cannot operate in this environment without it.
Yeah, and Peter, we spoke about the importance of purpose for brands in a context not just of millennials buy or boycott, make buying decisions, and not even because in B2B clients are demanding that you bring diversity to the table and understand. But you brought up a third reason that was important, involving talent.
Right. So there is a war for talent out there, and you can look at the unemployment rate of 3.9%. But if you go deeper than that, you realize that the unemployment rate for college graduates and higher is about 2.1%. So the war for talent among companies is extraordinary. And then there is the added piece that not only once you recruit and you've attracted someone to your company, you've got to retain them because it's a candidate's market. They can move. In 2020, 50% of the workforce will be millennials. And I think there's an awful lot of conversation around millennials that tends to be a little bit judgmental. Well, this is what they like, this is what they don't. The reality is it's the largest pool in the workforce in history. And just to add to that, there are 10,000 baby boomers reaching retirement age every day. That's from AARP. So you have this extraordinary shift in the workforce, and that is necessitating companies to be purpose-driven. To have a purpose. And I think the other point I would make is that traditionally employees have been motivated mostly by wages, and that's been expressed through labor unions historically. But 40 years later, employees are now looking and saying to their executives, I don't like the way you let that executive hang around after sexual harassment charges had been made. I don't like the fact that we are now selling our technology wares to DoD for reasons that I don't agree with. And I think it goes back to Lisa's point. What is your purpose as a company? And I think the big challenge, particularly for larger companies, is if you don't have a purpose, if you don't have a set of values and you haven't communicated those to your workforce, they may very well leave, or they may find that they're not in agreement with the decisions you're making as a company. That the ability of employees to do their own research on who their employer is or might be is extraordinary. The Glassdoor that Lisa and I walked through when we were looking for a job was literally the door. Now it is the website. So there's all kinds of information out there. And if you're a millennial, you've been in the workplace never knowing anything other than access to the internet and the information that you need.
No, that's important. And Stephen, you wrote a really interesting column about the challenges facing journalists to get business leaders and business contacts even to return calls on the phone when it's about your agenda. Sure, they want you when it's something they're pushing, but it's not quite a two-way street. And how is that impacting trust, especially when a crisis comes up?
Well, it's impacting it a lot. There's been a generational sea change in terms of media relations at big companies. And basically, they're not set up to handle anything other than crisis communications with business reporters. They don't put their telephone number on their website. They often don't have anyone to email other than a Dropbox. And if you write to the Dropbox, you may or may not get a response. When you get a response, it's from a 24-year-old who doesn't know anything and who only wants to know what your deadline is and what your questions are. And if you're lucky, you get a response to written questions with an email. But this is a sea change from when I started out 30 years ago in business reporting, where you could call people, they wanted to talk to you, they wanted you to talk to their executives, they weren't afraid of you, they didn't distrust you, and most importantly now, they feel as if they can communicate with the world directly without your intermediation. And that's the very strong sense when you deal with large companies today.
Yeah, and Gabriel, you've mentioned in covering the Clinton campaign, access issues. Obviously, you want to get to know the candidate, be able to have, whether it's off the record, but just really understanding. In the good old days, say 5 years ago, people could have a beer with the candidate or with the business person that they covered. Now, there's also a time challenge on both sides of the equation. How do you navigate that, and what's your experience been about getting access to get answers to the questions you want answered?
Sure. Well, my experience comes from the realm of political campaign coverage primarily, but of course I've written about companies too. Within that, I think the question of access is a constant question for reporters in any field whatsoever. But the question now I think is specifically relevant, or particularly relevant, as we discuss how businesses handle this new environment, because everything does feel political at this point. And the answer is, it's much easier to cover an institution, cover a person, when you truly understand their motivations. And so it is important to be able to talk to them as a human being and get to know them a little bit. And to your point, when you're dealing with a business that is trying to step into a more political or purpose-driven realm, it's very important to be able to actually understand the motivations beyond simply profit and to get to know the actual decision makers there. And that's something that we're seeing more and more. Companies and campaigns, obviously, are going out of their way to now more proactively reach out to people who are writing about them or covering them, and of course engaging more political professionals to show them how to do that, specifically because there is this acknowledgement now that they're all one and the same. As long as you're not just talking about an earnings call or something like that, you're going to have to deal with the same group of people talking about them and same group of people writing about them, and so it's become an environment that's very it's very fluid.
If I may, I am thrilled that that's what you're seeing, because I think Peter and I have talked about this. That's how we are advising our clients, that they have to have a conversation. They have to be available. They have to be accessible. They have to tell the truth. Yeah. And that 24-year-old that Stephen talked about, that person is highly valuable to me. That
highly
person,
valuable in what sense?
Well, I think that they're smart. I think that they are trained. I think that they have a place in the workplace. I think they have a role, and I think, as Peter indicated with the numbers, I think they are our future.
Yeah, and Stephen, just as a sidebar, some of my favorite children are 24-year-olds, and the good ones are,
my point, look,
are pretty good.
you
But
always,
we understand what you're
You always
saying.
want a frontline person. The frontline person doesn't have to be the one that answers the question, but it's the only person you get to deal with.
Yeah.
You know, I find it sort of strange that a lot of companies have, director of media relations and vice president of media relations, and there's senior vice presidents of whatever they call it above that. And for some reason they're always too busy to pick up the phone and just say to a reporter from a major media, "Hi, what do you want? What's your question? Can I help you? Can I answer your question?" They're all too busy. They rely on the 24-year-old basically to tell you that we're not going to talk to you.
Yeah.
I don't know what else they're doing. Apparently they attend a lot of meetings with each other, but they don't spend a lot of time with reporters.
Oh, go ahead,
Can I just
Gabriel.
respond very quickly? And when I'm portraying this sort of best case scenario version of what I was just talking about, this kind of outreach usually happens on the proactive side, and when company is trying to make a point or trying to push something, it's very different on the reactive side. If I call a company and say, not even there's a scandal going on internally, but I want to get your take on something that's happening politically, you get a very different reaction.
Look, you can't, politically, I can understand why that might be a hot potato. If you want to ask them about their marketing, if you want to ask them about their human resources policy, you can't, simple vanilla variety business questions that business reporters used to ask businesses all the time. You win a contract, you lose a contract. Basically, these media relations operations are now set up to keep you away. And they don't want to deal with you, and they don't trust you. And you are a problem.
So given that you're a, quote, problem and perceived that way, and clearly that's been your experience, I think this side of the panel would say, well, those companies are probably not going to do well because that's just bad PR. And when they need you in a crisis, then you're not going to be in a mode to be like, oh, great, what can I do? I want to hear your story. I mean, do you then publish, this happened, I tried to reach out for a response and got nothing? Because most companies I know and nonprofits, et cetera, hate that kind of stuff coming up. And if they see something like that online in a story, that's a conversation from leadership down to the PR team, like, what's going on? What are you doing that you didn't respond?
I think it reflects the leadership's general viewpoint about the media. I think, in fact, it's a pretty good reflection of the priority. Somebody in a previous panel mentioned that, some media relations people report to human relations, some report to legal. That's really a bad idea, with all due respect. And then some report to marketing. It didn't used to be that way. They used to be external relations, community and external relations. That was part of media relations, and they had access to the top executives. That's not true anymore. The reason for press relations is to communicate with my employees, to communicate with my customers, but to communicate with my shareholders. But the idea of being part of a system in which we help the world understand how business works, and we trust the mainstream media to help get that message across, not in a particular day for a particular company, but in a general way. We participate in throwing information in the general pool so the world understands why and how businesses work. Businesses do not see that that's their responsibility anymore. Right. Their responsibility is to get their message out when they want it, and that's it.
Yeah, now Amazon paid the price for that in New York, if you followed that through, because clearly they didn't have a message of what they were doing that was positively received. They had a soft majority there, but no one was super entrenched unless you were one of these 24-year-olds who might be looking for a next job and psyched that Amazon.
I'll just give you an example.
And
of course, this is a company that's owned, that is founded by the owner of my newspaper. But Amazon has very proudly had a media relations strategy of no comment. They're actually quite polite about it, but they just say no comment to everything. Okay, so every other CEO in America looks at that and says, well, let's see. His stock went up about 8,000%, and he said nothing. So what am I going to do? Maybe I'll do the same thing. And a lot of them have taken a page from Amazon, so there's no need for it.
I think Peter's got a comment on that.
I wanted to touch on a couple of things that you focused in on in your piece on today. I do think that it's a pendulum swing. You know, the whole idea of having owned media, as we call it in the profession, which is
we really love that.
Yeah, we can push out our messages as we want it, undeterred. I think there's been a move to, yes, we want to get our message out, much like traditional advertising. You're sitting at home, you're watching a show, you haven't asked for it, but suddenly a company's message is in front of you. That's what advertising is. That's paid advertising. You're interrupting somebody's day to say, here's what Procter & Gamble wants to tell you about their particular product. Then Owned came along, which was, now through the website or other means, through social channels, I can push that message out. What it doesn't provide, to your point, is it doesn't provide third-party validation of that message that you get from great reporting. And they need, companies need both of those, and they need a mix. And I do think there are companies, just like you said, who've made the calculation, why would I bother with Stephen Pearlstein? Why would I bother with ATR Media when they may ask me a question I don't want to answer? And the tenure of most CEOs has plummeted because the risk calculation that every C-suite is making about what may remove them from their position has changed dramatically. So on one level, I'm sympathetic to the idea that many in the C-suite say, no, tell Stephen I don't have time, tell him I'm busy, I've got a meeting. I think that's a mistake. And I think that there is going to be a pendulum swing. I'm already seeing it where you do need the validation. You do need the reporting. You need that balance because people can smell when they're being marketed to. So I actually think we're going to see a renaissance in reporting and good reporting. I think, frankly, the president is generating a lot of revenue and a lot of eyeballs, and the Washington Post and New York Times are doing well financially, and I think we're going to see more of that. So again, I think it's a pendulum swing. I think all your criticisms are valid. I think just having sat in the C-suite with executives, I have some level of sympathy for why I don't want to put myself out there to take the question that I'm not ready for or to sort of step on the message I don't want to deliver. And it's a fair criticism to say, well, figure it out.
No, that's great. And Lisa, I know you have a comment. I do want to point out we actually did a survey at my company of journalists who call it the Brand Authenticity Survey. And one of the interesting findings was that 83% of journalists said an accessible CEO makes a brand more authentic. We also found more than 80% of journalists prefer, when given a choice, to interview someone from within an organization than a third-party expert, if you will.
Yeah.
Lisa, you wanted to add a comment to that.
I think it's clear. The model of the CEO, this pendulum that you're talking about, is heavily shifted over here. There is a new type of CEO who understands that he or she is required to be external, to have a point of view, to express an opinion, and to talk to the media. And an understanding that the media should be unbiased. It's not always. You are unbiased.
No, I'm biased. I'm a columnist.
But in your reporting, I think that you are fair.
Right.
I don't always agree with everything that you say. I often disagree, but I think that you are fair, and I think it is rooted in what you believe, and it is rooted in rigor. And so this new activist CEO that has to be reflective and conducive to the activist consumer recognizes that they have to have a relationship with you. And they are asking us, how do I have a relationship? How do I build that relationship? Because they are terrified. They are terrified, but they are asking. You look at a Dan Schulman, someone who says what he thinks, and he acts and believes on what he thinks. He wants to have that relationship.
And this is, you asked for ideas. There are some CEOs who are okay with that. There are a lot of CEOs, frankly, now, the ones who aren't quite in their 60s, but are in their 50s and 40s, who aren't particularly good at it and are afraid. And one of the things that used to happen is that people down the line used to talk to reporters, plant managers, directors of marketing, directors of human resources. And someday, one of those people gets to be the CEO. But right now, you can't talk. You sometimes can talk to the CEO, but you can never talk to the people underneath them who, frankly, are doing the work and really know what they're talking about. And they don't get any training for it. So you suddenly become CEO, and unless you've been the chief financial officer and had to do earnings calls, which is a very stylized form of interviewing, unless you've done that, they have no experience. And so they're really not training their bench in getting comfortable talking with the press.
Yeah, and Gabriel, do you have thoughts on brands reaching out to you? Obviously, it would have to be about the issues that are being discussed to have a chance, given your role as national correspondent for New York Magazine.
Yeah, I mean, it happens all the time. And as a general rule, I think because of all of these dynamics that we're speaking about, when a brand is reaching out proactively, there's a great deal of skepticism. Particularly because there has been for so many years this posture that if a reporter is going to be talking with a company in one way or another, it's going to be digging in some way or asking about something that's gone horribly wrong. So, when someone calls me and says, I have a great new idea for you and I work for X corporation, or, I represent X corporation.
Is that the best way to start a pitch?
Certainly not. Certainly not. But, this actually, I think to this greater point, does speak to something that you see on campaigns, actually, and I think that there's a very clear parallel here. And to the point that Stephen was just making, on campaigns, I remember vividly, we talked about earlier, I did cover the Clinton campaign. In the whole campaign, which was by the end, thousands of people were working on that campaign. It was essentially a startup, a large startup by the end. There were only 2 or 3 by the very end, but maybe a dozen at the max, people who were authorized to speak on the record with reporters at all. And that speaks to the idea that it's very important to, I believe at least, and I think many people in my profession believe, to offer some degree of transparency and at least allow other people up and down the line to talk, because it allows people to understand what the company is actually doing and what it actually looks like on the ground. And not everything in a corporation is decided at the C-suite. It was, a decision that the CEO is making alone. So the idea broadly that there needs to be, greater access up and down the line is sort of obvious from my perspective. And so when someone sort of reaches out to us and says, here's an incredible opportunity to write about this thing, can I send you a press release? There's reason for skepticism.
Understandable. So how do you get around that skepticism? And then I also want to get a point of challenges getting out in national media. That's so difficult. But first, what are some of the tactics to get around the skepticism, especially with the mistrust that's out there? And I think also a factor that you've alluded to is that people in the media don't have the time. I mean, I feel this in the PR trades at all. I used to be able to call someone and say, hey, I'm not pitching you a story. You want to come by my studio and I'll share what some of the things that are going on. I don't want you to write anything about it. I know you're not going to, but I think you should just know about this stuff for future.
I should have mentioned this whole development, this breakdown in the communication and the trust is at least half our fault. And that's because for the last 15 years, newspapers haven't been able to afford having beat business reporters. And business reporting has essentially disappeared from many newspapers. There are a few left, but not many, that actually have experienced business reporters who know about business and who know about industries. So the company says, well, I'm not here to teach you about everything. I'd like you to know something and have certain sophistication. So it is half of our fault, at least. But that's a reality that I think they need to deal with. And when someone calls up who does know what he's talking about, you have to deal with that in a different way and not assume that the person isn't someone you want to deal with.
Yeah, and Peter and Lisa, with the pendulum swinging back towards earned media, and with campaigns, it's almost impossible to get through on the national media. Do you think there's going to be a surge in trying to get executives on local TV around the country where they tend to be way friendlier as well, and pleased to have it to get that message? I mean, we're seeing that as an upturn where companies are more open to getting their executives out, where it's easier to better prepare them to handle the national stories and get a comfort.
Well, they're also more authentic when they speak in their own community. You can't, I have a client who's in Newark, New Jersey. That CEO has to know the media in Newark. That CEO has to know the community organizations in Newark. It has to know the business reporters in Newark before they have any credibility in terms of going out. So it's again, we talked a lot about authenticity, and that is rooted in trusted relationships. So I have a former client in the audience, and I'm smiling as I'm talking about some of our engagements, because our job was to make sure that he and his colleagues had a relationship with you and had a relationship with you. And also, and I appreciate the understanding that, but it does work both ways.
I agree.
We need time to build that relationship, and you have to have time. And unfortunately, our infrastructure does not always align that. And we talk a lot about trust, but a lot of this is relationships.
Yep, it's all relationships.
It's all relationships, and it takes time to build a relationship. And then both parties have to be willing to put that time into it and recognize that when you do communicate and you write, you're going to say what you're going to say. Right. And I get that, and I understand that, and I want you to do that. But it is also our job as communicators on behalf of our clients to tell the best story, but increasingly tell the truth. Tell the truth. And that's almost a starting point.
Yeah, and Peter, I'd like to get your thoughts, and then we'll give everyone a chance for a quick final thought on how we can solve this whole problem for everyone. Now that we've laid it out, let's get some solutions.
Well, I think in the same way that that social media has allowed companies to micro-target the people in the audience based on a profile, the same thing has happened with publications. There's any number of trades. So the question is trickier in the sense of what am I pitching and what am I trying to help my client get a word out? Because it may be that the right place, the right conversation I need to be is with a handful of customers who are reading the trades that I need to then get that story out to. And to Lisa's point, much like a local reporter, they're very focused on that. I mean, if you're talking to a trade reporter on a particular product, he or she is not likely to wander off to, well, let's talk about that lawsuit from last year if it really has nothing to do with the underlying issue. I think with the national reporters, I think you have to do your homework. And to Stephen's point, I do think companies have to build those relationships. And I'm very optimistic about the fact that companies are understanding the importance of the credibility that comes with national exposure. But why? Why am I talking to the New York Times? Why am I talking to the Washington Post? Why am I talking to the Wall Street Journal? And sometimes the answer is for this particular need, there's not. There's not an answer. I think to what you wrote the column on, if you're poking around and interested, I think that's a mistake that they didn't take the time to engage with you and talk about that. But I think that then goes back to the resource allocation. I've got to get this product out. I've got to help my client move things. Those are the group of reporters I'm going to talk to.
Fantastic. Lisa, final thought, and then we'll hear from Steve and Gabriel.
I have 8 people I'm going to introduce Stephen to between now and the end of the year.
Would you let me tell you a story? This may take.
Sure, we've got time for a short one.
Okay. So I wrote this column about a company that I was looking for a good company to write about, a well-run company, not good in the corporate responsibility sense, just a company that had won a lot of awards for employee relations, whatever. So I called this company up and said, look, I want to do a story about you. And basically, after a little bit of back and forth, they get back to me, well, our executives are too busy to talk to you. And so whatever. So I wrote this column that these folks read, and I get a call from a PR person at a company I won't name, saying, we represent another company, and if you'd like to do a story about us, go ahead. So we were back and forth a few times. They sent me some material. I guess I'll have to tell you what company it is. It's McCormick Spice, and they just bought French's Mustard. And it turns out that French's is in this big sort of battle with Heinz over ketchup and mustard. And I said, that's an interesting story. I'd love to do a story about what it's like to be a brand manager in there. How do you wage these battles? Do you change the bottle? Do you change the ketchup? Do you have the negotiations with the supermarkets? I don't know how it's done, and neither do my readers. I'd like to show them how it's done. So anyway, I've been dealing with the PR person, and finally he said, why don't you just call the company? And I called up the company and talked to the senior vice president for whatever is, thing. And she says, no, well, if you would like to write about the promotions we're doing for the coming grilling season, we would want to do that, but otherwise we're not going to show you our strategy. And I said to myself, How could anyone who knows the media say, would you like to write up our promotions about the coming grilling season? I didn't even know there was a grilling season, you know? But they're so into her own world that she has no idea who I am or how I operate. And if you don't have people who understand the press as this first or second line, you know, you're never going to succeed in that.
Agreed.
No, agreed. Gabriel?
Yeah, I think that's right, but I think that there is some responsibility on the press side also too. I think, not to reiterate what you've said, because you said it very well, the fact that there aren't beat reporters on a lot of these issues is a massive issue, and it's not a news judgment issue so much as it's an economic issue.
Right.
But I think this is also it's very easy to make a lot of this sound a lot more complicated than it really is. At the end of the day, it's on reporters to understand the motivations of companies. It's on companies when they're making pitches to understand the motivations and incentives for reporters, and the individual reporters, by the way, that they're pitching. In this situation, the fact that they're pitching you on the promotions about grilling season is it's a hilarious misunderstanding of how we think and what we want. As a general rule, what I have found, and again, I'm not writing company coverage every day, but what I have found is that readers are very interested in how companies are thinking about the political moment and what their values are, and by the way, how to project those values. So if a company is willing to actually provide real access and talk in a real way about what that looks like behind the scenes, people are fascinated by that. What they're not interested in right now is performative authenticity and the idea of, let's tell you about the promotions that have to do with this thing that's totally made up in the first place. So again, it's a question of understanding reporters who then understand the companies, and then together they can form an understanding of what people actually want, which is the whole point.
Great. So if you're planning at home to be grilling tonight, I encourage you to post an image of that with the hashtag #TruthOnTrial, because that might be one of the big takeaways. Another is what a fantastic, interesting discussion with this great panel. Really tremendous. Lisa, Peter, Steve, and Gabriel, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your time, audience, and thank you for your time here at the Schar School.